morning, brothers and sisters. I'm really excited to share some thoughts from Hebrews with you. I'm going to be starting at the end of chapter 9 through chapters 10 and 11. And the main 4 points that I'm going to focus on today are 1, Jesus is the perfect sacrifice. 2, draw near to God. 3, don't shrink back. And 4, live by faith. So let's jump in. First, I want to thank Charles for his great insights into the new covenant of Jesus. For both covenants, the shedding of blood is necessary to have forgiveness. And the old covenant required the death of bulls and goats, right? But the new covenant required the death and blood of the Son of God. I'm going to read chapter 9, verse 24. It says, "For the Messiah did not enter a sanctuary made with hands, only a model of the true one, but into heaven itself, so that he might now appear in the presence of God for us." So in the Old Covenant, these sacrifices entered a temple built by human hands that was only a copy of the heavenly temple. But Jesus, as the perfect sacrifice, entered heaven itself, something that the high priest could never do. Now I'm going to read verses 25 through 26. It says, "He did not do this to offer himself many times, as the high priest enters the sanctuary yearly with the blood of another. Otherwise, he would have had to suffer many times since the foundation of the world. But now he has appeared one time at the end of the ages, for the removal of sin by the sacrifice of himself." So again, Jesus is the perfect sacrifice because he didn't have to suffer many times in order to forgive our sins. He only had to die one time. He only had to suffer one time. He will only return one time in order to bring salvation to his people. And this is amazing to know that this is why Jesus is perfect. He was the perfect sacrifice, so much better than the blood of animals. Now I'm going to read chapter 10, verse 10. It says, "By this will of God, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ, once and for all." So again, I love how the author of Hebrews mentions multiple times throughout these passages that the sacrifices offered in the Old Testament never actually took away sin. That's why they had to do it all the time. And then it really wasn't even enough. Through Jesus' one sacrifice, one offering of his life, he has perfected us forever. That is amazing. So again, these are just some things that stuck out to me about Jesus being the perfect sacrifice. The next point I want to talk about is to draw near to God. So this comes from Hebrews chapter 10, 19 through 23. And as I was reading this, the main things that just stuck out to me in this section, the main phrases are, let us draw near, let us hold on, and let us be concerned. One of my favorite verses in during the crucifixion story is when the temple is torn from top to bottom after Jesus' death. And I love how the author of Hebrews here mentions that, and that we can now enter the presence of God through Jesus' flesh, comparing that to the curtain, and his blood. That's what gives us the confidence that we need to draw near to God. And again, other people have mentioned this, but that we get to have that personal relationship with God. We don't have to go through a priest, or we don't have to offer a sacrifice first in order to be able to draw near to God. We can do that freely through our relationship with Jesus. Lastly, we must be concerned for one another. We read this verse a lot, right? All of us know this verse that we can't give up meeting together, that we need to encourage one another daily. But the importance isn't gone. The Christian life is designed to be lived in community. And even now, It's still designed to be lived in community, and we need to still have that community with one another. We're kidding ourselves if we think that we're close to Jesus, yet we're far away from his people. Being concerned means you reach out to others to encourage them. Don't wait for someone to encourage you first, especially during this time when we are not still seeing each other face to face. We need to reach out to each other. We need to encourage one another to keep going, to stay strong. And that takes us, it takes initiative on our part to reach out to our brothers and sisters. Next, I'm going to talk about not shrinking back. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 through 39, it's obvious that these Christians were experiencing some intense persecution. And he's warning them not to shrink back, not to give up, not to return to their old lives and the old covenant that was more accepted by the world. I'm going to read verse 35. It says, so do not throw away your confidence, which has great reward. The same is true for us today. We can't give up and go back to our old ways of living. Our confidence in Jesus has a great reward, but we need to endure in order to receive it. And we have to make sure that we're not going back to the old ways of our lives. We're not allowing ourselves to be sucked into the world, choosing to think the way that the world thinks. We have to think the way that God thinks. We have to make sure that we are staying strong in our convictions and holding true to God's word. And we must live by faith. This brings us into chapter 11 and truly is the reason that helps us not to shrink back, not to give up. If we live by faith, it's what gives us the endurance. It's what gives us what we need to keep going. So Hebrews chapter 11, this is one of my favorite chapters in the entire Bible. These men and women won God's approval by their faith. That's amazing when you read that in this verse. And I want to mention that it's worth your time to go back to the Old Testament and read all the stories that are mentioned here. They call this chapter the Hall of Faith for a reason. And we can learn what it looks like to live by faith through their example. I've done this as a quiet time. It definitely will take time to go through each of these stories to know why did the author of Hebrews choose this person for the Hall of Faith. Why is their faith something I need to imitate? But we can learn what it looks like to live by faith through their example. And there are so many great examples. I'm going to read verse 6 in Hebrews chapter 11. It says, now without faith, it is impossible to please God. For the one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So living by faith is obviously very important to God. You don't learn how to have faith from living an easy life. You learn it from the challenges and having no other option except trusting in God's word. And that stands out to me as I read these passages. I know it was challenging for Noah to have faith in God, that it was going to rain for 40 days and 40 nights when he hadn't seen that happen before, when he was going to build a boat and put his whole family and all the animals on it. He had to truly live by faith. It took faith, and it was hard for Abraham to leave his home and to wander in the desert and to not know where he was going, to live in tents, but to trust God. That was challenging. And again, so many other things. It was challenging for Sarah when she was unable to have children and to still have faith that God, who promised her a child, that it was going to come true, even when she was 100 years old. You know, the times in my life where my faith grew the most have been the most challenging and painful times of my life. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. Those times in your life are when you're going to learn how to have faith. And then you use that faith when things are going well, how to trust in God through the good times and the bad. Faith is obeying God's word even when you think you know better. I want to say that again. Faith is obeying God's word even when you think you know better. As I read these verses, it stands out that all of these heroes of faith were looking towards the future as they lived by faith. They were focused not on where they were at, but on where God was trying to take them. They were focused on their heavenly home. The main story that stuck out to me the most in this is especially the one where Abraham, when he obeyed God and he went to sacrifice his son Isaac, he trusted in God's promises and he obeyed. He knew that he had always been faithful to him. He obeyed God fully. Abraham believed that Isaac still had a future even if he died. This is amazing. Abraham had never seen God raise someone from the dead, but he believed that God would do it because God is always faithful to his promises. And that's what helped Abraham to have faith, to obey. God had never wavered for him, and he wasn't going to waver for God when God called him to do something. By faith, Moses chose the hard life, full of suffering, over the easy life, full of sin and its short-lived pleasure. He chose to leave Pharaoh's house, to be outcasted even among his own people for a time, so that he could obey God and live by faith. As disciples of Jesus, we have made that same choice as Moses. We have chosen to live a life of suffering, to live a life full of challenges, and live a life full of faith over a life of sin and choosing our own way, getting to make our own choices for life, but instead choosing to obey God. Again, there are so many amazing stories mentioned here that I don't have time to talk about, so please go read them and learn how to imitate their faith in God. Even the author of Hebrews doesn't even go into detail about some of these stories, but you can go read them back in the Old Testament. So as it comes to a close, the writer of Hebrews shows us that even though these Old Testament heroes pleased God with their faith, they still didn't get what was promised because Jesus hadn't come yet. God's plan is for all of us to be made perfect together. The original readers couldn't give up on their faith, and neither can we. They knew these stories really well. They knew the Old Testament. They knew the stories of faith. They needed the reminder that these people still needed Jesus to come in order to be perfected. And so for them to go back to their old way of life wasn't going to give them that perfection. They needed to trust in Jesus. And the same is true for us today. We have to trust in Jesus in order to be perfected. I want to close by reading chapter 10, verse 39. It's probably one of my favorite verses as I read through this. It says, "But we are not those who draw back and are destroyed, but those who have faith and obtain life." Brothers and sisters, let's be people of God who live by faith until the end and receive our promised salvation. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you all have a great week and can't wait to see you again soon.